Live from Arlington, Virginia, this is Transport Topics Newsmakers, the digital interview series that gives you access to candid conversations between industry experts and a veteran reporter. Sponsored by Lowen. Here's your host, Dan Ronan.
Hello and welcome to this new edition of Newsmakers from Transport Topics. I'm Dan Ronan. This is our last Newsmakers of 2021, but we'll be back in 2022 with new editions and, of course, great guests. Our guest from Houston today is the Professor Margaret Kidd. She is a professor at the University of Houston focusing on supply chains and logistics issues. Professor Kidd has a very distinguished career in both the academic and business world, and she's an expert on the topic that we're going to be discussing today, nearshoring. Before we begin our conversation with Professor Kidd, I want to let you know that Lowen Color Graphics is the sponsor for this edition of Newsmakers. Their leadership has a short message that they'd like to convey to you. We'll watch it and we'll be back on the other side with Margaret Kidd after this break. Now we begin our conversation with Margaret Kidd. While the COVID-19 pandemic exacerbated the weaknesses in the global supply chain, before COVID, the mostly private operating supply chain, which includes ports, railroads, trucking companies, government agencies, and others, knew that the supply chain was fragile, but it always held together. But that all began to change about a year ago. One of the suggestions that's being discussed now to strengthen the future supply chain is called nearshoring, bringing some of that overseas manufacturing that's now in China and other parts of Asia back to North America, nations such as Mexico, Panama, El Salvador, Guatemala, and other nations in the Caribbean as well. Professor Margaret Kidd, welcome to Newsmakers. Did I sum up sort of what nearshoring is all about?
Well, thank you, Dan. You sure did. I mean, nearshoring is essentially moving business operations not only closer to our borders, but closer to where end-use customers are located. And, you know, this whole discoupling of U.S. manufacturing in China and Southeast Asia really provides us three choices. We can onshore, nearshore, or move to other regions.
And what are some of the other reasons? Because I read a story today, as a matter of fact, in preparation for our conversation, that this is already taking place. There's a number of companies that are starting to look at this, especially along the U.S.-Mexico border, not far across the border, maybe 12, 18, 20 miles south of the border, where the traffic and the transportation logistics issues would not be that difficult.
Well, there's always been a very rich ecosystem along the Texas and California borders and in cities like Juarez, Matamoros, even Tijuana. And we certainly are seeing some migration to Mexico, our neighbor to the south. But, you know, in the same by the same lens, we're seeing European manufacturers pivot from Southeast Asia to Turkey as their response to nearshoring for Western European consumers.
But this is not something that could just happen overnight. You can't create a toy factory or a tire manufacturing company. You just can't throw out some seed and some water and there you've got a plant in a couple of weeks. This takes a while. This has to be something that is a decision by a company to do this, and then there's planning and permitting and then construction. This is not a short-term project.
Absolutely. It is an intermediate to longer term process. I mean, certainly there could be manufacturing that's already established that could be retrofitted. But, when you take into account site selection and, again, permitting and construction, you're looking several years down the road. But now certainly been the time to investigate these geographic locations that are closer to our borders.
One of the reasons why it seemed that we went to putting a lot of our manufacturing in Asia, China, Vietnam, Indonesia, and the like, was because of labor costs, significantly cheaper than in the United States. Has those nations in the North American hemisphere, in Central America, have they become cost competitive now? Guatemala, El Salvador, Mexico, the like, are they cost competitive with Asia?
Well, the wages are certainly a little bit higher, but I think when you consider the cost savings with transportation and then apply quality principles, it makes for a very competitive argument in this environment.
How much of an impact, Professor Kidd, is the expansion of the Panama Canal? I know that was done finished up in the summer of 2016. There's a lot of discussion about how they're bringing those big Super Panamax ships in through the canal. Is this something that could be a hindrance, or would it be a help to the idea of nearshoring?
Well, the Panama Canal will allow ships that contain up to about 14,000 containers to go through. And so when you read in the news about companies like Amazon and some of the other big box stores chartering their own ships, these are ships that can handle up to 14,000 containers. So it makes for a very competitive landscape to consider Texas Gulf Coast ports and Southeast Atlantic ports as locations for bringing imports into the U.S.
You were talking a little about the transportation cost and the fact that along the U.S.-Mexico border, on the south side of the border, there already is a great deal of work that's being done. Is this one of the areas where you could see a lot of expansion over the next 8, 10, 12 years, that this is an area, especially because Mexico's economy has suffered during the pandemic as well?
Well, I see northern Mexico being very ripe to continue expanding manufacturing. And there's a major artery that goes from Monterrey to Laredo to San Antonio, and then up through Austin and Dallas. So we have the highway infrastructure to accommodate trucks and rail here in Texas. And when you also factor in that within 1,000 miles of the city of Houston, the Port of Houston, Port of Freeport, there's over 152 million U.S. consumers.
That's a lot of consumers. That's a lot of people and a very substantial buying power. Probably, just doing the math, that's a little less than half of the entire U.S. population.
Spot on. It is half. And so, you expand that mileage and there's a true geographic competitive advantage of coming in through Texas, whether it's through road traffic or port traffic.
An industry leader that I spoke with recently said that nearshoring is a great idea and he likes the idea, but he said it's not without its share of risk, especially because some of the nations that I mentioned at the top of the broadcast, there is some political instability and that there are concerns about the safety of workers there and the overall economic conditions and the stability of the governments in those countries as well.
That's a valid argument. If we're looking at Central America, certainly countries like Costa Rica and Panama have, very stable climates. Mexico is lacking some infrastructure that is going to be necessary to make a large-scale move to nearshoring, and also needs intellectual property rights protection and some more upskilling of the labor force. But automation certainly resolves some of this at the factory level.
What about the Caribbean? What about some of the nations that are in the Caribbean region as well? Is that an area as well that could be expanded?
No question. A name that keeps recurring is the Dominican Republic. And there's no question that obviously economic development is critical for Haiti to move forward as a country.
Yeah, Haiti just seems to be a country, Margaret, that has had more than its share of bad luck, both natural disasters and political instability for the last 100 years or so. It seems as though it's a country that just seems to just have more than its share of bad luck. That's just a good way of putting it.
Well, I think you're correct. There's a lot of structural violence, and I mean, it would be hard to convince a major manufacturer to really consider Haiti. The Dominican Republic's a little bit different story.
Okay. Do you believe that there are right now companies that, as they look at the situation post-pandemic, they're saying to themselves, their leadership is saying, we need to look at this. We need to look at this as an alternative to Asia, some of these countries?
I think you're seeing this across the board. Do I think every major corporation that manufactures in China is pulling out? No, but what they've been doing over the last 10 years is migrating more manufacturing to Southeast Asia, to Vietnam, Indonesia, Thailand, and we're seeing some nearshoring in Mexico.
We were talking briefly about political instability, and while China is a stable country politically, they do have their share of problems. Their economy is not as robust as it once was 5 or 7 years ago. The leadership of the country is concerned clearly about the declining birth rate of the younger population of the country, and there are some predictions that the country's population will actually decline over the next 20 or 30 years. So the trends for the Chinese government and the Chinese economy are not as robust as they were. That would be something too, I would imagine, to be considered.
Well, if you look at birth rates in the Western if you look at birth rates in Western countries, they've declined over the last several decades. So we're facing that same issue here in the US, in Western Europe, in Australia. But automation, I think, is going to be the key to bringing in that workforce of the future that's going to be smaller based on birth rate.
What about shipping costs? And I want to just tell our listeners that I wrote a story about this, and our viewers. I wrote a story recently about this at ttnews.com, and when I started doing the research on the story, Professor Kidd, I was stunned kind of at the amount of the cost to ship a 20-foot equivalent container from Asia to the United States, to Long Beach or Los Angeles. The numbers look like this, that before the pandemic, it was about $4,000 per box, $4,000. Now, depending on the cargo, it's about $14,000 a box. Big difference. And if that were to continue for any length of time, that would also be another thing. I would imagine that if you're in the corner office of the corporation, that might encourage you to look at other places to build your products and to get your products.
Yeah, and we've read throughout the pandemic about the shortage of containers, the congestion on West Coast ports. And I mean, there's folks paying $24,000, $34,000 for a container. And then this whole thing of chartering an airplane. I mean, Amazon has really mastered the pivot in this environment where they're, refiguring long-haul jets to haul critical materials back to distribution centers here in the U.S. So I think, COVID has certainly given us pause to rethink how we structure our supply chains, how we diversify our suppliers, And this transportation cost is getting passed on to the consumer, driving inflation. And, it's a compelling reason to get business in order and restructure where we're producing and where we're importing goods.
We're at about the halfway point of our conversation here on TT's Newsmakers with University of Houston professor Margaret Kidd. She joins us from her office at the University of Houston in Texas, and we are glad to have her along with us. Professor Kidd, the management consultant company McKinsey recently said that many companies, especially those in the apparel industry, are looking at nearshoring, and also because of increased automation, they're looking at ways to lower their cost, of course, and increase their profitability and also increase their efficiency. Is the apparel industry one of the industries that you could see moving in this direction? Because it is a relatively low cost in terms of a low cost industry, in terms of the factories and the like. Do you think that would be a good candidate?
I could see apparel, I could see footwear easily pivoting to northern Mexico or other parts of Latin America or the Caribbean.
How would that work? How would that work in terms of the time frame to put these type of factories in? Would it take a year, 2 years? What are we looking at in terms of a time frame?
I think you're looking at a couple of years to implement that, unless you can find manufacturing that already exists that can be retrofitted.
One of the things I do want to explore in a little bit of depth is the new, well, reasonably new, free trade agreement between the United States, Mexico, and Canada. Is the timing on that, being ratified by all three nations when it was, and then dealing with the pandemic, is the timing and the wording in that document make it advantageous to look at nearshoring? Is that sort of open the door?
I'm not sure that it's necessarily opened the door. I think the reality is there's really some strong push for nearshoring, and that certainly alleviates the pain of cross-border trade between the United States, Mexico, and Canada. So, it's a positive. We had NAFTA, but, during the NAFTA period, we also saw China grow as the superpower for manufacturing. But I think there's a really strong push and pull back to Latin America.
Good point. Thank you. Thank you for bringing that up. The fact that there already was something in place, the NAFTA agreement and this new trade agreement basically supersedes that in many respects with regards to the language. What about transportation? We talk so much about the trucking industry here. There is rail down to Mexico, Kansas City Southern, one of the Class 1 railroads, which is in the process of being acquired. There is railroad, there is intermodal. There's a lot of trucking activity that goes on between the United States and Mexico. Is there sufficient infrastructure in those Central American and Mexico being part of the North America quadrant? Is there enough infrastructure to pull this off?
Well, Mexico's got to up their game. They need a more sophisticated logistics network, and that includes both rail, highways, and digitization. And I think at the end of the day, we have to see what is the Obrador administration going to do to drive that connectivity. One of its first actions was canceling the Mexico City airport expansion, which was several $1 billion on its way forward. That was a major connector to the U.S. So, I remain cautiously optimistic, but I do think, there's a trajectory that is different than what we saw the last several decades between Mexico and the U.S.
Was that a bad decision in your mind to cancel it? I know there were a lot of political considerations in cost overruns, and there was discussion about payrolls being padded and the like, and some corruption allegations. Was that a bad decision in the long run for business, do you think?
Well, in a city with 20 million people, I would argue that you needed an upgrade of that airport, and that would have been the heart of the logistics network for the country. So I think it was a mistake. I mean, certainly, any country you deal with outside of the United States and certain Western countries, you have to factor in the corruption factor and the padding of the cost. That's just built into any capital project.
I want to just ask you this question about the trucking industry specific. If we do go to an economy where we do see more nearshoring and we do see more of this type of activity, do you believe that the trucking industry in this country, as it's currently set up, is pretty well positioned to handle what could be increased volume? Because likely there will be more cross-border activities, there'll be more of this type of work than that's currently being done. Do you think that we're in a pretty good position as far as the trucking industry goes?
I think, again, Texas is very uniquely situated to benefit from the Mexico trade and the trade corridors that exist. We're seeing some incredible research and piloting of autonomous trucks here in Texas, from Dallas to Houston and Houston to San Antonio, and we're just seeing a record number of software and high-tech companies congregating in Central Texas. So that innovation industry, and some people even are referring to Central Texas as the innovation corridor and referring to Houston as Silicon Bayou. We're a city based with a lot of bayous, I think there's going to be some great opportunities for those in the transportation sector here in our state.
I want to talk with you for a couple of moments, the remaining 10 minutes or so that we've got left, about some of the supply chain challenges, because this is something that you follow very closely in your work at the University of Houston. Almost 2 years now, and it seems strange to say that, almost 2 years into this pandemic and a year into this supply chain crisis, how will we know that this is over with regards to the supply chain crisis, or will it ever be over? Are we going to be in sort of this perpetual loop, Groundhog Day, if you will, of problems with this going forward, because the economy has changed so dramatically the last 2 years?
Well, our new normal is going to happen when we flatten the COVID curve, where we take leadership in getting vaccinations distributed to the less developed world, and when consumers pivot back to more normal, not only spending ranges, but balancing between services and consumer goods. So you balance out that supply-demand thing, you balance out the stop-start of work because of COVID outbreaks. So we probably have another 12 to 18 months for that to happen if we're being realistic. I mean, just this last week, one of the districts in Ningbo, which is the third largest port in China, is closed down for 2 weeks. So we will continue to see these outbreaks, and that will continue to impact congestion and problems within the supply chain.
And we have to remind our listeners that every time a facility in China or other parts of Asia closes down, someone's got to pick up that slack. Someone's got to find a way to get that product over to the United States into trucks and intermodal facilities, but it backs things up. It slows things down.
It certainly does. And as I explain it to listeners throughout the globe, it's a domino effect. We are interconnected. So, when a port closes down in China, that's going to impact ports here in the U.S. That's going to impact the truckers. That's going to impact the availability of containers. We are truly in this together, and there is no question we need to be working with other countries and be collaborative in resolving these bottlenecks.
Do you see opportunities not only in the Latin American and the Caribbean nations to improve the manufacturing diversity, but bringing more of that manufacturing back to the United States? I just did a story at ttnews.com today, as a matter of fact, before we started recording this broadcast, that a an electric battery company is building a new facility in Greer, South Carolina. It's a couple hundred jobs, good paying jobs, and they're going to be producing electric batteries for large trucks and cars and other type of equipment. Is this a time where the U.S. manufacturers can up their game as well and can bring some of this manufacturing back into our continental United States?
Well, Dan, you're headed in the right direction there. We are seeing a lot of onshoring, even along the lines of the electrical vehicle market. We have now mining here in Texas, mining for critical rare earth materials that are needed in these batteries that go in to electric vehicles, which is it's going to be a market that grows exponentially. Most recently, there's a company outside of Austin that's recycling e-waste to contribute to the minerals that are needed to create batteries. And within the last couple of weeks, I think everyone heard the news that Samsung is investing $19 billion here in Central Texas for a new chip factory. So good things are happening. I think there, again, it was a wake-up call. Time to onshore, time to nearshore.
One of the things in the Biden infrastructure law that was signed into law by the president about a month ago was that there's $17.2 billion in direct spending for the nation's ports. And the port leaders that I talk to say that those facilities really need an upgrade. If we were to conduct some of the nearshoring, even if we did that, we're still going to, for the next generation or two, have a lot of trade with China. And port officials are saying they're going to see a doubling of their imports over the next 20 or 30 years. So we really do need to invest in our ports, even if we do move some of that manufacturing to places like Greer, South Carolina, or to Matamoros, Mexico. We really do need to up our game at the ports, don't we?
I don't think it's an adequate amount of funds to upgrade our port systems. They are decades, and let me emphasize, decades behind European and Asian ports. There is no digital footprint. So it's not just the hard infrastructure, it's the digital infrastructure and the dredging, which is critical. I mean, it's an ongoing task at every port in the world. So we need more funds passing through these critical nodes.
Your port down in Houston is doing some of that right now too. They're dredging and widening the Houston shipping channel to accommodate the larger vessels, and they've got some big, very exciting projects on the planning docket as well, don't they?
Certainly, Project 11 is a really incredible. Project 11 is an incredible opportunity to expand the ship channel, and at Port Freeport, there's also a deepening and widening effort underway. And even if you consider Port of Corpus Christi, there's expansion of that port too. One thing that I failed to mention, I applaud Federal Maritime Commissioner Benzel and his data initiative. One of the infrastructures that I have advocated for is the port community system, where ports share data with all the stakeholders. This is what European ports do. This is what Asian ports do. So we have this great opportunity to keep American exceptionalism moving forward.
A number of inland port facilities are either being built now or are under construction. Salt Lake City with a large inland facility, Gainesville, Georgia, north of Atlanta. And on the water, there's a new one that I'm reporting at ttnews.com called the Louisiana Gateway Project, which will be about 20 miles from New Orleans, right on the Mississippi River. There's another one in Cairo, Illinois, at the confluence of the Mississippi River and the Ohio River. Are these the type of innovative ideas that policymakers and others need to be looking at? Because that land around the ports, Long Beach, Los Angeles, Savannah, and the like, that land is just so exceptionally valuable that it really doesn't make a lot of sense to use them as storage facilities. It's best to get the product further inland where the trucks, the rail, and other vehicles can get that product out and move it quicker.
I certainly agree. I think of Dallas-Fort Worth as being somewhat of an inland port for Houston, and even parts of central Texas. One of the strengths of our region is there's a great deal of land. There's over 14 million square feet of distribution center space being constructed as we speak now. So there's the capacity to add. It's not going to be on the docks. It's going to be inland, whether that's 30 minutes, an hour, a couple of hours. But we do have to think about infrastructure in terms of both maritime ports and land ports.
Professor, as we wrap up our conversation, are you generally optimistic or pessimistic about what things are going to be like over the next several years? And one thing I would think you'd agree with me on is there's going to be a lot of changes.
There's a lot of changes as we move towards Industry 4.0, automation, digitization, artificial intelligence. But we have a very unique opportunity with the infrastructure bill and, with the lessons learned from COVID to really turn this around. I like to tell my students, Charles Darwin said survival of the species was based on adaptation and collaboration. Amazon's an incredible example of those two facts.
Yeah, and they are, and this is time for another conversation at some point, they are in the midst of forming their own delivery network that is going to be nothing short of amazing in terms of its size and structure. And I think that's a story we're going to be reporting about as well in the near future. And we'll have to have you back on at some point to talk about that.
Well, I admire the Amazon model, their diversification. They've spent over $10 billion here in Texas. One of their most sophisticated distribution centers is 10 minutes down the road from myself. So we're anticipating a larger footprint here in the Gulf Coast. But also I think that this logistics as a service, the model they're moving forward with, is all about collaboration. So I think it's a good move on their part.
Kidd joining us from the University of Houston. In closing, we want to thank our sponsor, Low and Color Graphics, for making this edition of TT's Newsmakers possible. We also want to thank our guest, Professor Margaret Kidd with the University of Houston, for being so generous with her time and answering all of our questions. Going forward in 2022, we're planning more Newsmakers with some great guests, and we will have more information about that, about all of our guests. It will be available at ttnews.com. This webcast is available for, of course, viewing on demand. Just go to ttnews.com for more information. I'm Dan Ronan with TT News. We thank you for joining us.
Thank you for joining us today. For more information on future episodes, visit ttnews.com. This has been Transport Topics Newsmakers.